Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. I'm going to show you a really brutal attack in this game that arose from a very interesting gambit in the Gioco Piano. So this is Jorden van Foreest, the young Dutch star, against David Navara, and it was played in the Charity Cup. This is the latest online event in the Meltwater Champions Chess Tour organised by the Play Magnus Group. And please do join me for live commentary. I'm commentating with Peter Lecco on chess24.com, and well, it's also a fundraiser for UNICEF, helping children in Ukraine, so it's a worthwhile cause as well. So let's concentrate on the chess. So this is an ancient line of the Gioco Piano, and sometimes it's used as a very calm way of steering the game to a draw, for example like this, and then d5. This is quite a well-known way to make a draw after this move, and here, and the position can repeat itself. There we are. Or white sometimes plays the so-called Merle gambit like this, which, if black doesn't really know what he's doing, is highly dangerous. However, with best play, black is fine there, but white does have some activity. But recently, this move, knight d2, knight d2, has become very trendy. This is very much very current indeed. And curiously, just a couple of weeks ago, in one of my Patreon opening videos, I actually examined this in some detail. Alexandra Kosteniuk played this in the first Champions Chess Tour event in a couple of games. So the principal move, of course, is to take the pawn. One can decline this and play with d5, but actually white gets pretty good play with the isolated queen's pawn. This gives white a little bit of space, and white's pieces are very, very active. But taking the pawn is the principal move, of course. But here's the point. White pushes with d5. Of course, if black is able to get in d5, then black is just a pawn up for nothing. But d5 just kind of upsets black's position. Knight takes. There are other ways for black to play this, but you know, this is a reasonable way of playing. And here d6 has been played in a few games, but actually, well, black takes and then is able to give back pawns, and it's pretty safe for black. But this move, castles queenside, this is a pretty new idea. This has come to prominence quite recently. Mamedyarov played this a few months ago, for example. So the idea is that white just uses the space to start a pawn storm on the king side. So here we go, h4. And really, black's king needs to go to this side of the board. So castles, h5. Now, if that pawn is allowed to advance, then in combination with a move like queen d4, then, I mean, this is too dangerous. So black really has to block this. And now rook g1. I mean, this is incredibly crude. So this is just the start of a pawn storm. And with kings on opposite sides, then it's very interesting. And here, Navara played c6 to get some counterplay on the queen side. Very understandable. There was a really recent rapid play game between Caruana and Nakamura. Interesting, you know, Caruana, when you get big names like Caruana spotting this gambit, then you think, okay, it's definitely worth a look. And Caruana and Nakamura went b5 in this position, which was declined. And then here, and actually Caruana won a really nice game. After this, let me just show you, and he broke through brutally. I mean, in this line you can see that all white pieces are in play. Of course, if king takes, then the queen is going to come in here. All white pieces are in play, and because this pawn is on d5, it gives white that space, but also rather cuts black's forces in two. It's very difficult for black's forces to find their way over to defend on the king side when white has this big space. Bishop g4 is the computer move, thinks that that's a reasonable way to defend. But, well, I've had a look at this in some detail, and actually, yes, the computer thinks that black is okay here, but black has to play so precisely when you have moves like this coming, not to mention potential sacrifices. One false move and black can just lose instantly. So I can understand why bishop g4 wasn't played. I don't think it's not a very human move, not a very practical move somehow. c6, to my eyes, is a human idea. You know, you're looking for counterplay on the queen side, you're breaking open the centre, and white's king, after all, isn't very secure at the moment. You know, if the king were on a1, that would be a different story, but with the king on c1, then c6 is a very logical move. White continues with g4. And I looked at this position in my Patreon opening survey. And here, in fact, there is a previous game that went like this. And now bishop d3 is a really strong move. Now there's a little tactic here. Let me just show you this because it's very interesting. Bishop takes g4 is possible, so that if rook takes, then queen c8 checks. And then you take the rook. But in this position, knight d4 is a really strong move. The knight is on such a beautiful square, blockading that d5 pawn, takes control over f5. And this bishop is going to be chased out of the way. The g file opens and the queen looks down on h6. I mean, this is absolutely crushing, actually. So after g4, Navara played f6 to just hold up g5 for the moment. But you have to realise this leaves some really weak squares around black's king. And in fact, the computer now recommends simply taking this pawn with check, of course. And if d5, just taking like this. So now material is even. And then just putting the king on b1, the knight can go to d4. And actually, positionally, white is doing pretty well. Not to mention the fact there are all these beautiful light squares to attack on. And another variation, if king h8, this is a nice move. Knight h4. You're going to play knight g6 and open up the h file, and that could well be fatal for black. So it's kind of an obvious move to take here, but again, maybe not a human move. Van Foreest probably just didn't want to give any counterplay for black, didn't want to free black's pieces, but it does seem like a strong move. So he played knight d4, which is, to my eyes, a very logical move. He's looking at these weakened squares. Navara now played c5, maybe a little bit unexpected, because you know the c file remains closed. But if knight e6, this is important. First glance looks pretty good. You know, if white can reroute this bishop onto this diagonal and get a queen and bishop battery here, looks pretty good. Not to mention f4 and g5 to open up the g file. But in fact, black is in time to push these pawns down the board and get serious counterplay. So after c5, Van Foreest played knight e2. Now I thought that black should just give up a pawn to open up the b file and get some counterplay, but rook b8 is a bit slower. And Van Foreest put the bishop back on b3, b5, bishop c2. So he's looking to potentially play queen d3 with that battery on the diagonal. But c4 stops that. And now, finally, the Dutchman goes for his pawn storm. He's found enough time with f4. And he just wants to push with g5, crack open the g file and get on with the attack. But black is not backing down. b4, g5. So who's going to break through first? b3. Now, here's a fascinating moment. Pawn takes pawn on h6. Now, here, Navara took on c2. Let's have a quick look at b takes a2, because at first glance you sort of think, wow, that pawn can't be stopped. So basically white has to checkmate on the other side of the board, but white can do that like this. Check. Check on h7, of course supported by the bishop. Rook g1 check. The knight has to interpose. Bishop takes, and actually this is just winning for white, because if black mates a queen, the bishop comes all the way back to block the check, and that's mate in a couple of moves. Bishop g4, rook g4 mate. That's the main variation anyway. So it just shows, you know, you can actually allow black to make a queen. But after taking on h6, Navara took on c2. Now, if rook takes, this doesn't have the same effect. Actually, black is winning here. If queen takes c2, threatening mate, then bishop f5, and black has survived and is winning. Piece up. So pawn takes pawn. So again, this is incredibly direct, incredibly crude. You know, white wants to push that pawn all the way to h7 and end the game like that. Well, clearly the rook has to move. And here, well, Navara makes the human move, which is rook f7. In fact, rook e8 should hold the draw. I won't go into that. Let's just concentrate on the game. Rook f7, h6. So threat h7. And this is actually winning for white. Bishop f5 was played. Let's just have a quick look at king h7 to block that pawn. Well, here, very simple move, knight d4. So that covers the f5 square. It prepares queen takes, prepares queen g2 as well. Let me just take you through a couple of variations. So bishop f5, I suppose, is the obvious move to try and block the diagonal. But knight takes, and now queen g2, threatening a big check here. And when the knight goes back, this is beautiful. You get a queen. If queen takes, then check and mate on h8. And if knight takes, this is wonderful. Queen g6, and now queen g7, and double discovered checkmate. Fantastic. So that's the main variation after king h7. But bishop f5 was played by Navara, which is very logical. But white wins like this. h7, so that opens the h file. Now there's more than one way to win. Van Foreest selected the pragmatic, prosaic way to win, which isn't too complicated. He could also have played queen takes. And of course, if that's taken, then rook h8 mate. And if f5, then knight d4, and the queen switches over to the h file, or rook takes, and that's actually winning for white. So queen takes c2 is kind of the flash way to go, but rook takes bishop is pretty simple. And then knight d4, so he's just preparing to bring the queen over, and that's the end of that. King g8 played, queen h2, threatening mate on h8, rook takes g7, and now there's a knight fork on e6. Everything falls into place. And now it's just a case of mopping up. There's actually no checkmate here. It's pretty close, so Van Foreest just cashes in. And the queen is just way too strong here. Yeah, I mean, Black's forces are, I mean, with all these weak pawns and this F pawn as well, I mean, Black doesn't stand a chance. So the game finished like this. The F pawn advanced. And Queen G7, so that prepares just to push the pawn all the way. So knight takes, and now White picks up the knight. And this is just a case of mopping up. That queen is just too much. The king comes up to blockade. And now, as is very typical for these kind of positions, that's a Zugzwang position. Whatever move Black makes, then the whole thing falls apart, and the game ended like this. Queen c5, well, another pawn is going, and that really is the end of that. Do join me for live commentary on chess24.com starting at 1800 hours Central European time.